Good morning, and on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, let me welcome you to our conversation today. We are extremely pleased and honored to have such a distinguished panel join us for a conversation about Euro-Atlantic relations and increasing our understanding of Russia following their invasion of Ukraine, and trying to figure out how to chart a pathway forward in Euro-Atlantic relations with the foundational relationship between the United States, the United Kingdom, and France. We are seeing history unfold in real time right now on the European continent. And I am extremely honored to be able to welcome three distinguished ambassadors to have this conversation today. Before we begin, I did want to start just by making a mention of the fact that we are, of course, reflecting on the loss of Queen Elizabeth today and the important role that she played in global politics, in European politics. Obviously, you could not overstate her impact on the relationship between our three countries over her 70 years on the throne. And so we're very mindful of her important role in history today as we reflect on what's happening in Europe vis-a-vis Russia and try to make sense of the path forward from here. I think the conversation is very timely. Perhaps over the summer, many of us had kind of cemented our opinions about what was happening in Ukraine and where things would be headed. But now that the conflict seemed to be settling into a longer-term conflagration, the United States, the UK, European partners are thinking more about enduring a longer conflict, having to work together over a medium and long term rather than a short-term issue. It is a good idea for us to kind of revisit some of our assumptions. And to do so, it is important for us to have experts who have experience in Russia on the ground representing three allied countries. I'm proud to have with us Ambassador Tom Pickering, who had a very distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, including ambassador to the Russian Federation from 1993 to 1996, and currently serves, in addition to several other roles, as the chairman of the board of CSPC. So we're very pleased to have him this morning. Also, Ambassador Sir Roderic Lyne, representative of the UK to the Russian Federation from 2000 to 2004, also among a very impressive litany of diplomatic accomplishments on behalf of the United Kingdom, and Ambassador Stanislas de Laboulaye, who also had a very distinguished career in the French government and was French ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2006 to 2009. We have an absolute wealth of knowledge and experience in terms of our relationships with Russia. And thank you all for being with us today. Before I turn it over to the ambassadors, starting with Ambassador Pickering for some opening thoughts on where we go from here, I did want to mention that back in January of this year, CSPC leadership put together an op-ed looking at the situation in Ukraine. This was prior to the February invasion, and we laid out a series of economic tools that we thought might be brought to bear to potentially discourage Vladimir Putin from going on with the invasion. It may or may not have been successful if we were able to implement all these tools, but we were hoping to explore the idea of credibly threatening some very significant economic sanctions and other quite radical, what seemed radical at the time, tools to try to change the behavior of the Russian regime. Unfortunately, the invasion happened. Almost all the tools we recommended threatening were put into actual practice. It wasn't our intent actually to suggest that we deploy them, but rather that we use the opportunity to rally our alliance together, to gather NATO leaders together and show some solidarity around some common threats. And we weren't able to organize quickly enough to do that. And I think we're learning some lessons now about what we ought to think about in terms of the future, of course, with the goal being crafting some workable relationship with Russia over the long term that also protects European security, a very difficult challenge. Having said that, I'm proud to have this panel with us today, very honored to host this. And I'd like to ask if Ambassador Pickering might start us off with some reflections and thoughts from his perspective on where we go and how we should be viewing the current situation. Ambassador Pickering, thank you and welcome. You're still on mute, sir.
Thank you very much, Glenn. It's an honor and pleasure to join you. And because I'm in a bandwidth deficient area, I'm going to take the video off. That probably is an overall net contribution to the program, but I will, in one way or another, try to cover in a few minutes some of the questions that you have so cogently raised. But before I do, it is a real honor and pleasure to join Sir Roderic and Ambassador de Laboulaye in what I hope will be a challenging and very interesting piece on perhaps the preeminent policy problem of the day, even including the long-term and deeply troubling China relationship for all of us. In any event, I have to say that I begin my conversation with a sense of deep depression that we have in some ways descended to a point where recovery seems to be distant and very, very difficult in terms of a challenge. And I say that against the backdrop of a period of service in Moscow where it appeared we were making progress and where there were hopes that perhaps wildly misplaced that things would change over a period of time that could in fact be something of a watchword for a future with the then former Soviet Union more closely integrated into the international community, more interested in playing a major role and less interested in the problem that I believe in a unique and unusual way has hooked Mr. Putin to what I think now is the malign future of our relationships, in large measure driven not exclusively by, but enough by the sense that his preoccupation is perpetuation in office as much as it is Russian nationalism, Russian great power status, both of which are ancillary policy supports for that kind of look. Let me now just say a few words about the Ukrainian problem, which I think is again a full illustration of the fact that the rules of the game, particularly on the nuclear side, which I've been preoccupied with for years, were clearly beginning to be shaped by the Cold War in Cuba. Not well, not quickly, not, I think, entirely cogently, but were. Much of that has been set aside by mutual threats about nuclear. And while I don't believe a nuclear conflict is imminent, people who act as if it could be imminent are not contributing to the kind of capability to avoid that kind of global calamity, which is inherent in occupy both of the common seats of what I would call supervised potential destruction that we think, and I think, is a particularly bad position today. I will now just say a few things about the future. An announcement within the last 2 days that the strategic arms limitation talks might well begin and might well consider further reductions in nuclear arms is a positive move. Similarly, US-Russia cooperation on space within the last couple of months is another contribution to moving along. In the meantime, it is hard to gather strength out of these two movements alone for a situation in which we are both punishing each other's embassies and finding clear ways to cut contacts. Ukraine is, of course, the dominant feature, and America's tradition in dealing with enemies is basically demonization, and unconditional surrender. And I find this particularly bad, but I also find that the new British Prime Minister is unfortunately deeply embedded in this kind of attitude. We badly need continuing communications, even if it does not produce miraculous shift. Optimists among those who follow Ukraine that I have recently been talking to believe there will be a chance, perhaps as early as November, for some kind of stalemate-driven reopening of conversations. At the moment, we seem at least to be able to continue moving on such questions as grain and Zaporizhzhia, neither of which is perfect and one of which is still to be fulfilled, but is important in bringing the question ahead, and both sides do manage prisoner exchanges. These are important as well, in my sense that without diplomatic contacts, there is very little room for the kind of forward movement we need. And the diplomatic contacts do not emerge full-blown from one announcement, but take a long and difficult period, both to begin, to harbor, to nurture, and to consume. And let me leave it there. There's much further to be said, but it's an honor and pleasure to take on this particular task and to deliver a few remarks. And thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. I'd like to turn the floor over now to Ambassador Sir Roderic Lyne for his thoughts, his perspectives, given his experience and thoughts about the current situation and the road ahead for Euro-Atlantic cooperation in this realm. Would appreciate, Sir Roderic, your thoughts, and thank you for being with us. I think we may have just lost his video at the moment where I called on him. Let's give it 5 seconds and see if we reconnect. The miracles of technology allow us to connect with former ambassadors who are all over the world at the moment. And yet it's not perfect. So we will work with it. I think I would like to go on and call on Ambassador de Laboulaye, if that's fine with you, sir, and perhaps we can return to Sir Roderic when he's able to reconnect. Is that fine?
That's fine with me.
Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I have to tell you that I'm very honored as well to be able to be with you today. I had the privilege of meeting with Ambassador Pickering quite a few years ago in Boston at an event on Iran. Maybe he remembers that. It was very interesting. And as I had been a negotiator in the Iran negotiations from the very beginning, when they started in Europe, it was very interesting for me to exchange with my American colleagues on that question. And Ambassador Pickering was the luminary of our discussions. I'll take the problems slightly differently in a very European perspective, as you can imagine, to say that the shock for us in Europe was, of this invasion by late February was huge, absolutely immense. We knew what was being prepared. I myself had been ambassador in Russia when the Russians invaded Georgia. And what was happening in Ukraine was exactly what had happened in Georgia before, with troops massing at the borders. But the same disbelief in Europe was there, like it was in Georgia. We just couldn't believe the Russians would invade. So it came as a shock, even though American intelligence that had been transmitted to Europeans and the scale of the troops around Ukrainian borders and the Navy could very well have told us what was going on. The second thing is that we were also appalled by the scale of the operation. We could have thought at first that the Russians would probably try to have a kind of Donbass plus operation where they would widen the territories conquered in 2014, or maybe even have a territorial territorial gains to protect Crimea towards Kherson. But having such an attack coming from the north towards Kiev, the capital, was clearly another issue. That meant, in fact, going for the Ukrainian leaders, going for a regime change in Ukraine, overthrowing the government, and having Ukraine subdued to Russia, which brought us back to terrible memories, which we had thought in Europe were gone, because precisely what we had done since the war was to build a European Union, first a common market, but then the European Union, precisely to avoid such a situation, to create a model which was open to others of a peaceful world. And there we all of a sudden discovered it's very difficult to have an island of peace when you're surrounded by aggressive imperial powers. So the second shock was that we were back to the blitzkrieg that our parents or grandparents had known, the invasion of Poland and what had preceded the invasion of Poland, the Anschluss, and what had followed them, meaning concentration camps, civilian massacres, and so on. We were back to what we had hoped would never happen again. And that was on public opinion and on our leaders as such, who had made such efforts all those years to create something different in relations between countries. It was a real shock as well to discover that, in fact, European Union as a model was the future of the European Union as a model was at stake. And that we hadn't reacted properly, because in fact, by definition, the European Union was not made to react to such an aggressive attitude. The third shock, I must say, and that was especially difficult in France, was to discover that we weren't supported by a lot of countries throughout the world. The resolutions at the UN General Assembly showed that, of course, there were some countries that voted against condemning the invasion, but a lot of very important countries like India or South Africa or Brazil abstained. And that is also a great shock to discover how little support, in fact, we have. We have a very Western attitude to what is going on, and the rest of the world doesn't really want to share our view of things. And we have a hard job in front of us trying to rebuild some type of more, let's say, more favorable attitudes in the rest of the world. The last thing which I would like to underline is that we must, as Ambassador Pickering said, we must all the same, even though talking about dialogue with Russia for the time being is absolutely taboo, we must think of the day after, how we will be able to renew our links with Russia, maybe on specific items like nuclear question, environment, health. COVID has shown us how much international cooperation on health issues is important. But those are very important points that we will have to discuss with Russia before even talking about some type of new European architecture for peace and security. So those are the few preliminary remarks I'd like to make.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very much appreciate your opening thoughts. I believe we have Sir Roderic still with us, and he may need to keep his video off due to bandwidth question. But Sir Roderic, if you can hear me, I'd be happy to turn the floor over to you for some opening thoughts as well. I'll try one more time. Not sure if the connection is completely lost, but Sir Roderic, if you're there, if you'd like to go ahead and take the floor, we would welcome hearing from you. Not hearing anything at the moment. We'll work on getting him reconnected. I know that Joshua has a long list of questions for all three ambassadors. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and turn over the floor to Joshua to start putting those questions out. We have about an hour to do the question and answer portion of the conversation today, and a lot to cover. And I know he intends to bring in audience questions and provide an opportunity for that as well. So let me go ahead and turn the floor over to Joshua to move the conversation forward. Ambassador Pickering is still on the line, but I think he may just have leave his video off, and we'll work on getting Sir Roderic reconnected. And Ambassador de Laboulaye is still with us on audio and video. So Joshua, go ahead and let's take the conversation forward, and we'll work on the technical part.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Representative Nye and Ambassador de Laboulaye, for joining us, and Ambassador Pickering. And I do hope we can get Sir Roderic back as well. Ambassador de Laboulaye, I want to start with you first, because I'm very glad that you mentioned the 2008 war in Georgia. I want to start with Ukraine, but looking specifically at this, President Sarkozy and your role in resolving this crisis, the President Medvedev, I'm curious if you think there are any lessons that can be drawn from that conflict and its resolution that could potentially inform the resolution of the present crisis with Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much for this question, because that war, the 2008 war in Georgia, was very short, and so seems to have been slightly forgotten since that day. But it was a very important moment, and probably it was the first sign that Russia would very well and easily intervene on its outskirts without any problem. So the first lesson was, yes, the Russians are ready to intervene on a military basis. The second thing was that in August 2008, the Russians discovered how weak their army was at the time. And one of the reasons why the European mediation with President Sarkozy, France had the presidency of the European Union at the time. So it was basically a French and a European mediation. One of the reasons why it seemed to have been slightly successful is because the Russians were probably not feeling strong enough to be able to prolong the war and to, for example, to conquer Tbilisi, the capital. So they brought back lessons from that war, saying that they absolutely had to reform their army, and that's what they've been doing since 2008. And they came to the conclusion recently that they had managed to reform their army, modernize their army, make it more efficient. And their action in Syria probably gave them the impression that Syria and Crimea gave them the impression that they were strong enough to be able to intervene this time with more success in the Ukraine. Thirdly, and that's something that is not well known, but President Sarkozy went himself all by himself to Moscow to negotiate with Medvedev. But Putin, who was then prime minister, came over, and it was a threesome negotiation. So the real leader at the time, of course, was Putin, who led the negotiation. But when Sarkozy came back in September, after he had been to Strasbourg at the European Parliament to explain the results of his negotiation and what he had done, he came back to Russia. I don't remember if it was in Moscow or in Sochi, but he came back with the president of the Commission, Barroso. And the attitude the Russians had towards Barroso was horrifying. They didn't give him a car. They didn't give him a pulpit to speak. They absolutely neglected him and decided he was out of the picture. So it was that attitude of the Russians toward anything that had to do with the European Union, which was also another great lesson, and it shows to this day.
Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Sir Roderic, are you back on the line? I think we may unfortunately still be suffering from some technical difficulties. I'm not quite sure if you can hear us, sir. Oh, we've unfortunately lost him again. Well, we hope to get Sir Roderic back. I want to pivot from Ambassador Laboulaye's comments. And Ambassador Pickering, building off of that, I wanted to see, based on your thoughts, do you think that we have, and I use the royal we, an appreciation and understanding of Russia that is sufficiently well informed to confront the current crisis, but also to build a basis for a future relationship with Moscow? And if you can hear me, sir, you're still muted.
I am, Josh, and thank you very much for a very, very interesting and challenging question. And it's one that's been a perennial. In many ways, following Mr. Putin, who I had an opportunity to meet while I was ambassador there, and he was the deputy to the mayor of St. Petersburg, has been a chase of an expert in dissimulation and hiding. Deception has long been a Russian military asset, maskirovka. And in many ways, therefore, understanding and appreciating Russia has had significant barriers to it. George Kennan demonstrated that what 15 or 20 years of investment can do is enormously important and really very valuable. And we, following in the footsteps of that, spent a great deal of time training people in Russian and assigning them to Russia and places where Russia had influence in order to bring together the best that we could an appreciation of where things were going. In some way, the Russian approach to that was to be as unpredictable as they could be, consistent with pursuing their own national interests. And so if you asked for a report card, in my view, on our understanding and appreciation and capacity to be predictable about Russia with a degree of some certainty in managing our policies, it was at best a B- on a scale from A to D. And that meant in effect that there were mistakes made. In my time, the biggest mistake made was that we had no concrete view in common among ourselves about how one moves from a communist economy to a capitalist economy. And there was a saying around at the time that Adam Michnik, a Polish economist, said that it was like turning a fish bowl into fish soup, to go from capitalism to communism, but the opposite was not quite so easy or discernible. And in many ways, those remarks are significant and important. While I was there, principal questions were how do 180, 200 million people or so keep themselves fed? Post-harvest losses were legion. Some of the rest of it was, how does a country which has run heavy industry on the basis of Gosplan making a majority of decisions turn itself into a market-driven economy where those decisions come out of an appreciation of movement of economic forces and trends and not out of bureaucrats in a large room in a big building in Moscow. And the other questions were, where is Mr. Putin headed? Well, I think there's a Nobel Prize out there waiting for someone who can not only convince us that he or she understands, but has now produced the definitive answer to that particular problem. Critical, in my view, is the issue, is Russia going to wish to continue to be a separate player on the international scene, moving in an orbit that it defines, doing what it can to be a spoiler and a changer of people who in many ways adopt, adapt, and beyond, and are part of a Western liberal system, liberal in the best sense of that word, or are they going to, in a way, become the masters of what is hierarchical, determined by Moscow, and so on? And where and how is China going to fit in this issue? I raise that question because China is a very important part of this three-way split among big powers, and more importantly, the four-way split among the European Union and the other three big powers in terms of how and in what way the game is going to be advanced. And we are constantly challenged. I wish we could adopt a view that some ways in the past informed American attitudes in this nexus of contacts and non-contacts, that we need to have better relations with at least one of the two, China and Russia, than those two have among themselves as a way to proceed. And I would suspect that my friends and colleagues from the European Union would look at it in something of the same parallel, that the European Union, a very populist enterprise with tremendous capabilities, certainly in the economic area around which it is made and functions, as Ambassador de Laboulaye has told us, is a growing and increasingly most important player on the world scene, and we should not forget that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pickering. Sir Roderic, can you hear us?
I can hear you, and
Fantastic.
I can see. Can you hear me and see me?
We can hear and see you, and we welcome you back.
I do apologize. I was taken out by Zoom, and it took me a very long time to get back in, but it now seems to be working. If I can just make a few of the remarks I might have made earlier. I mean, firstly, just picking up what Ambassador Pickering said, I very strongly agree with him about everything he said about China and how we have to consider China in the Russian context. If I just could backtrack a bit, I mean, firstly, Glenn, I'd like to thank you for your very gracious remarks about Her Majesty the Queen. And at a time when we're mourning an exceptional monarch in Britain, it's appropriate to recollect that in 1994, Queen Elizabeth became the only British sovereign to pay a state visit to Moscow, actually at the time when Ambassador Pickering was serving there, and that in June 2003, which was during my ambassadorship, she received Vladimir Putin as the first Russian president to make a state visit to the United Kingdom. Putin on that occasion caused the Queen some hilarity when he referred to Windsor Castle in his halting English as her dacha. And I think that perhaps gave him some ideas about building palaces for himself. If we could have stopped the clock at that moment in June 2003, when Putin had developed close relations with the West, with NATO, with the EU, had become a full member of the G8, both the West and Russia could have regarded the very difficult transition since the late 1980s from Cold War and communism as a remarkable success, although it had been painful at various points. And much credit is due here to the late Mikhail Gorbachev and also indeed to Boris Yeltsin and many others. Those 15 years showed that we can build a different form of relationship with Russia. And had Vladimir Putin not mistakenly been installed as Russian president by Boris Yeltsin, I do not think that we would be where we are now. And I think that brings me straight into the present conflict. We now need to be ready for anything. We've entered an attritional phase of this war, with both sides having taken heavy losses, depleted, exhausted, winter coming in. It's Putin's war. It's not a war that almost anybody else in the Russian elite would not have launched this invasion in February of this year. But Putin will never abandon his obsession with gaining control of Ukraine. And I think he still believes he can do so through attrition by grinding the Ukrainians into submission, however long it takes, relying on Russia's historic resilience, by mobilizing and equipping more troops, by using heavier weapons, by pummeling Ukrainian cities. And I think critically, he calculates that over time, Western support will weaken. And he's going to do everything he can to divide and disrupt and undermine the West. Indeed, at some point, I think he's very likely to try to tempt the weaker Western brethren with offers of a ceasefire and peace negotiations in exchange for the mutual easing of sanctions. And that would be a ploy to divide the Ukrainians from their backers. But looking at this the other way around, Putin's position is fragile. His military have performed very badly. Their morale is low. Unlike the Ukrainians, they're not fighting for their survival or their homeland. The Russian economy was weak before this crisis began. Sanctions have now hit it very badly, and they will have increasingly severe effects on Russia over the next year. Popular discontent in Russia over living standards, over casualties, over the wide consequences of the war will increase. Kowtowing to China is not a popular policy. No Russian ever wanted to be the junior partner of China. They know that China drives very, very hard bargains and is looking to exploit this situation. So I think that we are likely to face a situation of effective stalemate under low intensity conflict for months and years ahead as probably the most likely, but by no means the only scenario. But if the West maintains its support, and if the Ukrainians continue to hold the Russian forces and with smart tactics gradually push them backwards, it will become more and more apparent within Russia that Russia has gained nothing and is taking massive damage. And at this point, Putin would have his back to the wall. He would be under very strong pressure to find a way out. Now, that in turn raises the obvious and unquantifiable risk that he would resort to escalation. It also raises the possibility of a sudden collapse of will on the Russian side. If faced with collapsing support, Putin's instinct would be to go for yet harsher measures of neo-Stalinist repression to protect himself and his close associates. And these could work for a while, but not indefinitely. Finally, is a peace agreement possible? Well, there have already been some partial and sectoral agreements, and some form of ceasefire and line of control could develop over time, de facto or de jure. But there will only be genuine peace between Russia and Ukraine, and an end to Russia's confrontation with the West and a return to a more stable and secure environment in Europe, if and when Russia recognizes and respects Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. And I simply cannot see that happening while Putin remains in power. All of this means that holding the West together is critically important, and it's going to require strong and I think sophisticated leadership. And I note the remarks that were made about our new Prime Minister, with which I would not disagree. Up to this point, there has been remarkable solidarity with Ukraine in the UK. We have fewer dissenting voices in this country than in some other allied countries. However, when this conflict is over, and when the Putinists have gone, which may not be for another decade, we shall all need to get over the current Russophobia. We will need to recognize that there was substantial opposition to Putin's war in Russia. We will need to restart the work that we did in the past to coexist peacefully with Russia and to cooperate to mutual advantage with Europe's largest country. And as Ambassador Pickering remarked in his opening statement, it is absolutely vital that we should keep open some channels of communication to Russia and not demonize all Russians because of the, I think, imbecilic decision of their current leader.
Sir Roderic, thank you very much. You raised a number of questions in your remarks that I very much want to pursue. I wanted to pivot and pull on one of these, turning to Ambassador de Laboulaye. President Macron most recently received criticism for a statement that we must not humiliate Russia so that the day when the fighting stops, we can build an exit ramp through diplomatic means. And it seems to highlight a difference in approach at this early stage of how to resolve the conflict. Certainly, Secretary Austin said that we need to effectively militarily defeat Russia, or certainly militarily weaken them. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the differing levels of expectation for the resolution of the conflict and how that may apply to European unity. Ambassador Laboulaye, can you hear me, sir?
Oh, I didn't know if the question was for me.
Sorry, sir.
Since Macron made this statement, well, things have changed quite a lot. And so, as he said the other day to the ambassadors, we had a meeting of all French ambassadors at the end of the month. The time is no longer for negotiations. The time is to help be behind Ukraine, help Ukraine as much as possible, help the Ukrainians fight back. And the meeting yesterday in Ramstein with the defense ministers, American and European defense ministers, shows that the European resolve is on that side. But the truth is that in the future, we will have not only for reasons which are quite self-evident that we need to put an end to this war when the two parties agree for an end to the war. We won't be the countries that will ask for the end of the war if the two Ukrainian and Russians do not want an end to the war. But there will be an after, and we have to prepare for this after already. But of course, for the time being, the priority is being behind Ukraine as much as possible.
Ambassador Pickering, if I may pull you in on this question of the challenges of European and allied unity, which Sir Roderic had raised. What do you see as the biggest challenge in the near term to maintaining that unity of support? And how may that level of unity of support change in the coming months?
Thank you, Glenn. And let me thank Sir Roderic for his excellent remarks, along with Ambassador Laboulaye, and associate myself with the condolences you passed on. It is a sad day for Britain and for all who are admirers of Her late Majesty the Queen. I think there are several answers to your question that need to be put together. One, Sir Roderic, I thought mentioned a moment ago, that is those within the Allied nexus that in one way or another are either frightened or in some way beguiled by the notion that Mr. Putin has something useful in the relatively near future to offer in terms of a peace settlement in Ukraine, will need to be quite careful about how they proceed and whether in fact he is successful, as he has not been for a long period of time in wedge driving, not just between the United States and Europe, but within the European community itself, both the EU and NATO. And I think that part is very significant. The second piece runs to the other direction. That is whether out of frustration with the long duration of the conflict, another interminable war, we get into a position where the hawks among us begin to advocate a series of steps so far carefully guarded against by President Biden. In my view, perhaps too assiduously. I think there are things that we could do which will not break the line on World War III. But obviously, it is wise, particularly given the nuclear equation, to be cautious. And so were we to be beguiled or pushed or thought to be the choosers of a better policy in the direction of heating up the conflict by much more direct involvement in the conflict, perhaps on the territory of the Ukraine, and perhaps with even more aggressive and effective weapons that were used in significant part against Russian territory, we may well be crossing the line on the World War III issue and open up the Western alliance for further rifts around that particular issue. So far, I think the constant attention that we have all paid to the new relationship, and indeed the outrageous moves of President Putin that have driven us closer together, have been the dominant factor here. And the notion that we have a lot to worry about because there is an imminence of splits is not, in my view, in the first priority category, but always to be guarded against.
Thank you, Ambassador. Sir Roderic, please jump in.
Yeah, can I comment and agree? We need to be very clear about what the Western objective is in this. The West has not gone into this in order to defeat, let alone humiliate Russia. Although there's been some rather foolish rhetoric, not least in this country by inexperienced politicians, to that effect. Our objective is very clear. We are supporting Ukraine in preserving its freedom and regaining its full independence. And we are also seeking a return to security and stability in Europe. And these two things are indivisible. Europe will not be secure if we were, as the West, to try to pressure Ukraine into making an agreement with Russia, which required Ukraine to surrender territory and left Ukraine divided and with an antagonistic relationship with Russia, and left Russia looking to continue to assert strategic control over Ukraine. We will only get our objective of peace and stability by securing Ukraine's independence. And until Russia is minded to accept that, we need to continue supporting Ukraine. I think the other point that Ambassador Pickering made about being extremely careful over the risk of escalation is critical. Sitting in retirement in London, I have admired the way in which NATO and Washington in particular, the American administration, have handled this. I think they have been sensibly cautious. They have pursued an incremental policy, even if it's only a 1 or 2% risk that Russia might resort to tactical nuclear weapons. That would take us into completely uncharted territory, and 1 or 2% would be far too high. They obviously are communicating between the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff in Washington and General Gerasimov in Moscow, and that again is critical. Public pressure, and again some wild statements, I'm afraid, by British and other politicians would have had a less sensible, less prudent policy, but they are right, and I do hope they continue with that.
Adding on to that, Ambassador de Laboulaye, if I may ask you a question, sir. We've imposed countless sanctions, significant trade embargoes, and effectively severed 20 years of economic connectivity with Russia. What, if any, sticks do we have left potentially to influence Russian behavior outside of that which we are already doing? And then equally, are there any potential carrots to incentivize a change in Moscow's behavior?
Well, the question of sanctions is becoming more and more on the front line of the discussions in Europe for the time being, and there's quite a debate, not only in France but in other continental countries, about the use of these sanctions and if these sanctions are not hurting us more than they are hurting Russia. We all know that it's not a short-term instrument. That there are three, let's say there are three levels of sanctions. The first level are the sanctions that aim a certain number of oligarchs, political leaders, and so on. They have a very limited effect. Maybe they have a psychological effect, but they have no real effect on the course of things. And maybe even Putin is quite happy to see a certain number of oligarchs being punished that way. That's not very, let's say that's not a very important level. The second level are the economic sanctions that we know. And they are, for the time being, quite hurtful for us. We've seen that during the summer with food prices going up. And we don't know exactly how our public opinions will carry on reacting in the months to come if inflation goes up very high. President Macron has said we have to be brave now. We have to know that there'll be a lot of sacrifices because it's a long-term issue. The third level, and I think that's a more efficient level, are the trade sanctions, where we stop sending sensitive equipment to Russia. There's a whole list of and that can be very, very powerful as sanctions, probably the best level to act on Russia. So we'll have to work on that together with our allies to be more and more efficient. That is probably the level where the sanctions will be the most useful.
Sir Roderic and Ambassador Pickering, if I can ask the same question for you and your perspectives of the use of the tools that we have available thus far, if there is any sort of additional carrot or even stick, or rather carrot, that we could potentially use to incentivize or change Moscow's behavior. And I'll go Sir Roderic first and then Ambassador Pickering.
Yes. We have to bear in mind that these are the strongest sanctions that anybody has ever imposed. And they are going to have an increasingly deep effect on the Russian economy, particularly sanctions on the import of technology, which is affecting Russian defense production. They're short of semiconductors. They're having to buy alternative ones of a lesser quality from China. In the hydrocarbons industry, which is vital for Russia, again, without Western technology, they have trouble with their gas compressors. They have trouble with their fracking. Oil production is going to decline. They have increasing trouble producing gas. So in a sense, we've already used some very, very big sticks. We need to allow a certain amount of time for them to work. We also need to bear in mind that the Russians are sanctioning themselves. When they cut off gas supplies to Europe, Europe was 83% of their gas exports. They cannot send those molecules of gas that come from Western Siberia and the Yamal Peninsula anywhere else. There are no pipeline connections to China, and they have already limited LNG export facilities. So I think this is a really important area. If we can succeed in capping the oil price, that will be of enormous benefit. And this brings me to the other point. Where we can have an impact and where there is now a bit of a political battleground is on third countries. Putin is trying to gather support so he's not so dependent on China. In places like the Middle East, he's continuing to trade with India, sell discounted oil to India. I think Saudi has a very important role to play in this, so does Turkey. So the West needs to be very, very active in convincing these important swing countries, if you like, that we are in it for the long term. We are in it for very, very strong reasons of maintaining international law and preventing anarchy in the world, and indeed of delivering a message to anybody else, such as China, who might think of using such tactics. So it is in their interests to be full supporters of this endeavor. And if the Saudis can help us to reduce the price of oil, that will have a massive effect on Russian income.
Ambassador Pickering?
Glenn, just let me pick up on this. I think that I'm a little bit in the position that there is an old Washington statement, everything has been said, but not everybody has said it yet. Although I hope I can add something to what has so far been very, very well presented. And secondly, the old Lend-Lease statement that we'll give you the tools and you will finish the job has been turned a bit on his head. And we're a little bit, I think, unnecessarily concerned with the fact that the statement may be, give us the job and we will finish the tools. And we need to worry about that a bit, but I think not too much. I see 5 points of leverage against Russia at the present time, each of which in one way or another has its own role. Standard, normal, bilateral and UN sanctions, which we've discussed and which are having their effect, and I will add little to them on that. The second is political isolation or separation, both in a multilateral basis, which I think is extremely important, and Sir Roderic has laid that out. And that has to be, can we open a better set of relationships with a significant number of countries who are inclined to vote with us, but timid about Russian intervention in one form or another, and maybe Chinese and India. And a third piece, which is really should focus on China and India, and perhaps others who are weight carriers in the international community and who have something really important to say. And one of the areas in India is there a replacement for near total dependence on the Russians for maintenance of the present Indian military equipment stock? And is there further work we can do in bringing the Indians along in new weapons acquisition? And can that be done in a way that preserves security? India and Russia just agreed yesterday to withdraw troops more significantly from the area of Ladakh, where they've had confrontation. And steps like this, I think, are important. With China, I think it's very significant that John Kerry has been working, despite what I think were the errors of the Pelosi visit to Taiwan, once again to see if he can rekindle serious Chinese interest in moving with us on the question of climate change and energy policy. I think that there is the very important factor we have discussed of where the military battle goes and how and in what way leverages that stem from that can be useful. At the moment, I think there is a seesaw quality about our tendency to overestimate the capacity of one side or the other, beginning with Russia in the early days, beginning with the Ukraine immediate victory, given the strength and depth of their resistance and the flow of armaments to them, now moving to more of a sectorization where we see unexpected but real serious progress south and east of Kharkiv by Ukrainian forces, and the potential for isolation, if not removal of Russian forces from the western bank of the Dnieper River in the area around Kherson and Mykolaiv, which can be helpful in resetting the equation. And a final piece, which Sir Roderic also, I think, very wisely touched on, was the hydrocarbons issue. He will know more than I, because I think these things happened during his ambassadorship and that of Ambassador de Laboulaye. But I was very impressed looking then as a former ambassador from the outside at the degree to which in earlier parts of this century, unanticipated moves in the market for hydrocarbons set Putin back quite seriously at various times on meeting his budgetary requirements. And while he's not an economist and appears somewhat oblivious at times to economics, this, in my view, is perhaps the not yet fully exploited piece that we should look at. And I think we can bring Saudi Arabia so that the invasion of Ukraine is not a generator of vast new dollops of income to Russia through hydrocarbon sales at higher prices is an important effort to get after. And while price setting is a perilous economic gesture in some ways, for the short term, it might have the kind of impact that could help to make a difference. And finally, in my statement, I think it is time to think about bringing the major oil producers in the sunny and windy parts of the world into the renewable equation. They have a lot to gain. They have the capacity to invest in questions that are important, whether it is moving to the hydrogen economy, where they will have a role, moving to the sunshine developments for further electricity production, moving into the wind-driven area, but also investing money in things like the more effective and efficient long-term transmission of electricity. If the end product you have available to support the world is electricity and not something that is used to derive electricity, then you want technology in those areas. And I think the big investors could, in some ways, help to be more dominant in the future energy world than they realize, and save a lot of their hydrocarbon energy for the irreplaceable purposes that they have constantly talked to us about wishing to do.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. And for the audience, please do submit any questions to the Q&A function if you have them. I'm going to continue with sort of the questions that I have in the interim. I'd like to take a step back, because one of the key themes that has been spoken about by all three of our speakers has been the importance of the multilateral engagement and the partnerships in confronting this challenge. We've recently seen Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO, but starting with Ambassador de Laboulaye, I would like to get your thoughts on how this could change European security architecture. You mentioned how President Putin was very dismissive of the European Union back in 2008 with the Georgia crisis. I'm curious what trends you may see coming out of this specifically for the European Union, but more broadly for the European security architecture. And then I'd like to bring Sir Roderic Lyne into that after your remarks, sir.
Well, the first conclusion and the immediate conclusion was that Europe was not ready for any type of confrontation by itself, that it needed the transatlantic alliance. So for the time being, we've put aside any type of reflection on the European defense construction. We have to build inside NATO, and probably because we don't know how Congress in the future will react, not be too dependent on the United States. We've seen recently with the past administration that made us quite nervous about the future of NATO, that we need, as Europeans, to feel strong enough to take our responsibilities. So the first reaction would be how to consolidate European presence inside NATO, and the arrival of Finland and Sweden is a very good sign. All European countries apart from Turkey voted in favor of that. But at the same time, we saw a country like Denmark deciding to lift its reservations about participating in the European defense system. So I think we can very well carry on believing that building on European responsibility, European effort on armaments can very well go along with NATO. Every European country, and especially Germany, as we've seen, have decided to make important efforts to increase the level of expense in armaments. So we will carry on that way, taking probably more responsibility inside NATO, but carrying on as well, consolidating what we have had already on the European side, maybe on the industrial armament side. It is important that the Europeans built a common European industry in armaments to avoid being entirely dependent on foreign industry.
Sir Roderic, your thoughts on how this may change the European security architecture, obviously with the United Kingdom no longer part of the European Union, but the Ministry of Defense in particular has been very forward-leaning, very aggressive in supporting NATO's engagement, doing multiple deployments and support. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this needs to change, both in terms of NATO, but also the UK's role in European security architecture.
For the last few years, I've talked about the West and written about the West in inverted commas. Thanks to what Putin has done to reinvigorate the transatlantic alliance and reunify Europe, I've taken the inverted commas back off the West. Stanislas is quite right in saying the question now is how do we consolidate this? For years, it has been apparent that the European contribution to NATO is inadequate, that we have indeed cruised along on a sea of American money and support and armaments and leadership, and we've taken too much of a backseat. That absolutely needs to change. It's not just a question of increasing budgets, though that is something we need to do. And the present British government, the new British government, I think is talking about going up to 3% from 2% of GDP. I mean, remember at the end of the Cold War, we were spending 5% of GDP on defense, even as late as 1990. It only went down to 4% by the year 2000. We've been struggling to make 2% in this country. Germany at last needs to get really serious about defense. It will take some years for Germany, whose army is so far behind the curve, to reestablish a serious capability. But the other critical thing, I think, is that the British government should start to behave like a grown-up. For the last 6 years, we have had, since the referendum, and particularly under Boris Johnson, a government which has been picking childish and stupid fights with European allies and partners, using playground language, tearing up agreements that it itself, or threatening to, that it itself negotiated. And this desperately needs to change. Liz Truss needs, I hope she's getting some good advice on this. She should be going straight over to Paris, Bonn, Brussels, to say, all right, this is the issue that really matters. There are all these other issues, whether it's about fish or people crossing the channel in boats, which is an important issue to our domestic public opinion, or the Northern Ireland Protocol. They should be dealt with in a sensible, grown-up way and negotiated rather quietly as adults. But we should really get back closer to Europe. There's no prospect of this country in my lifetime rejoining the European Union, much as I regret that. But there is no reason at all why we should not bolt ourselves much more closely onto political cooperation, security cooperation, foreign policy cooperation in Europe, rather than pursuing the, as I say, childish attitudes, playing to a very populist far right in this country that we've seen under Boris Johnson. And as the largest, or with France, the largest military contributor to NATO, we really have potentially a big role to play. And I hope that as a result of this crisis, we will start to play it. But I'm not holding my breath. We have a completely untested foreign secretary. We have a completely untested prime minister, very, very inexperienced, both of them. And they got some good advisors, but are they going to listen to advice? I do not know.
Ambassador Pickering, we have a question rather from one of our senior fellows at CSPC asking about the Russian attack on Ukraine and its implications for sort of broader Russian foreign policy interests and behavior. Lieutenant General has suggested that it was a distraction, with Africa being the real ambition. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question. I find it hard, having spent a great deal of my career in Africa, to believe that Africa is somehow the hidden objective of the attack on Ukraine, given the immediacy of Ukraine to Russian interests. The Putin theories and fables about Ukraine heavily focused on that, and the necessity to keep a Russian public with him on the Ukraine through a combination of Goebbels-like management of information.
I think you may have cut out, unfortunately.
The
Oh,
whole
you're back.
question leading up into it. So I don't see what that does. We do see a growing and increased Russian interest in Africa, the use of the contract mercenaries in various places, and some increased in investment and other work in Africa. I don't see it, however, as newly preponderant in that part of the world, or as something that in one way or another represents a long for Russian area of future expansion. I rather see that closer in Asia, in reconstituting the former Soviet Union territorial space to the degree that that can be done. And that seems to be being done by smaller bites rather than by larger digested pieces. And to some extent, that's a help, because that's not something that we can or should agree to take place. In the same time, I would agree with the general that Africa deserves significant and I think increased attention, whether it is in its parlous health and education programs, which constantly get attention but never seem to, in one way or another, funding and ideas and capacity that just doesn't produce itself either out of Africa or alone, or Africa under the supporting arrangements that both former colonial states and non-colonial states with a significant interest in Africa continue to produce. And I think that that's something worth a separate program here, so I won't bedevil that further.
Thank you, Ambassador Pickering. I want to ask a very big, broad question, taking a step back. And I'm going to first direct this to Ambassador de Laboulaye, but I would like Sir Roderic and Ambassador Pickering's thoughts as well. What do you think in a post-Ukraine environment is a viable relationship with Russia, given the present circumstances as we understand it? And what can we do to work towards that relationship? So, Ambassador de Laboulaye?
I think the first stage is to have Russia accept that there are sovereign countries surrounding it, accepting that a country like Ukraine has a right to be independent and really independent, have its sovereignty. So that's a very difficult first step before we can start building anything strong with Russia. The second step, I think, is what I said just a few minutes ago, that we can probably start building on a certain number of important issues, like the nuclear issue, the energy issue, the climate issue, the health issue. And slowly, brick by brick, we can start talking with Russia. And then maybe at a third stage, if the two first stages are accepted and go somewhere, we can start talking about some type of common architecture for peace and security on the continent. But I mean, this we've been talking about since 1975, since the Helsinki talks, which were quite successful, and Russians might have rather bad memories of it because it rather turned against Russia. But I mean, since then, we haven't made any progress, even though we have come out with a certain number of ideas since that period, in the early 90s and even in the early 2000s. But there's nothing like European architecture. I mean, you remember that just before the invasion, the Russians pretended that they were offering a new plan for a security and peace architecture, which was a kind of ultimatum. In fact, was unacceptable to us. So if they have that in mind, of course, we cannot talk with Russia on any type of architecture. But in the future, maybe we can try, even if these two first stages are agreed on.
Sir Roderic, what are your thoughts on a possible relationship with Russia beyond Ukraine, and what should inform that relationship?
If Putin understood soft power and he'd used soft power, Russia had enormous soft power in Ukraine, and he would never have needed to take military action against Ukraine. Stanislas is quite right in saying that you have to start with Russian recognition of Ukrainian independence. I cannot see that coming from Putin. I think it's a problem for the whole of Putin's generation. But there will be generational change. Putin is going to be 70 on the 7th of October. There will be another generation taking over in Russia over the next few years. And there's plenty of evidence to show that younger Russians have accepted that Ukraine is a foreign country. And Russia has got to do that. It's got to remove the threat from Ukraine. When you get to that point, yes, you've got some deep wounds that will need healing, some deep animosities. But at the same time, you have a lot of underlying synergies. You've got many economic synergies. You've got huge cultural and interpersonal connections. You've got thousands of Ukrainians who work in Russia still, or who were going to Russia for work. You had huge numbers of Russians doing it the other way around in Ukraine. They are natural partners. Now, so is Britain and France. So is France and Germany. We have our spats. After the Second World War, we had a huge job to do in healing Europe. We succeeded in doing it because we had common interests. And there is a very, very obvious, very, very strong Ukrainian interest in having good relations to its east, as well as developing its relations to the west. This should not be a zero-sum question in the way that Putin, in a traditional Russian way, has made it into a zero-sum question. And the same is true for Russia. So I think it can be done. It will take time. It will take generational change, but it's perfectly feasible. And I believe it will happen. I think, if I was alive 40 or 50 years from now, I think we'd be looking at a very different picture.
Ambassador Pickering, your thoughts?
I have just a few ideas to add to what's already been said, large pieces of which I fully agree with. I think that much of what we can do will depend on two interrelated questions: how we handle the issue of Russia and its relationship with us and around the globe between now and the time when something will happen which will open the door to what might be a phase called the end, or the beginning of the end, rather than the beginning of the beginning, which we seem to be deeply engaged in now. Secondly, I had a view long before the war that economics was an important factor that we had tended to underemphasize and undertreat with. And there were certain American leaders of note who raised the question that Ukraine might be thought of in the long-term future not only as an independent country and fully deserving of that, but might be a bridge country between economic organizations, a bridge country in terms of its now fading background in production inside the old Soviet system, and a country where new advances in education and new opportunities to open to the West suited it for that kind of a role. And I think that should be looked at. I think that we will have to treat with the question of how and in what way does Ukraine wish to situate itself with respect to security, economic, political, and other organizations, and principally the age-old question of NATO, and perhaps the new question of being part of some Russian arrangement in the EU, or enough in both of those areas to have a foot firmly enough in both camps to be a bridge. I think that it's those kinds of things that might make a helpful change. I agree with Sir Roderic that it is extremely difficult to see how this happens under Putin. And it is almost as difficult for me to imagine a scenario in anything like the reasonably near term that puts Mr. Putin out of the scene. I wish I could tell you I had confidence in both. And I think that we need to face up to those harder realities. And that puts us in the position, I think, that I've mentioned. Picking off pieces, whether it's grain or Zaporizhzhia or prisoner exchange or short-term ceasefires or more openness to humanitarian relief, other things that can help improve the situation. I also am a little bit, I classify myself as a bit of a schizophrenic, that I would like to see more pushback leverage developed, and that can't be done by being kind and gentle to the Russians. While at the same time, I keep open at least the channels for kindness or the channels for communication that may be developable. And I mentioned this in an earlier answer to a question, but I think we could do more without hazarding ourselves into World War III by helping with airspace control inside Ukraine, principally from the ground, but maybe with the help of others who have aircraft that match Ukrainian needs that have not been produced, in part because they classified themselves as junk, but which could be, if we have time now, repaired and reusable, or Western aircraft that are not necessarily identified with a situation in which it looks like the West is putting forward a task force to attack Russia. And that might be aircraft of Swedish manufacture or other places which could give the Ukrainians some advantage. I think that may be more effective use, although it's been very good, of drones are important in perhaps rebalancing the military situation. And I would look obviously to military experts, of which I'm not one, to help us a little more in some of the things that might provide further advantages, but don't get us so close to the red line on World War III that we are unnecessarily hazarding that result.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Pickering, and Sir Roderic and Ambassador Laboulaye. Thank you very much for your time today and your insights. This is a very challenging and interesting time, and I think one in which we need to leverage expertise such as yours in these conversations and to find the solutions that we need. I'm going to turn it back over to Representative Nye for final remarks, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, let me also add my thanks to our three ambassador panelists today. It's been an honor to host you here, and a conversation I think we could take on for several more hours and easily fill with content. I'm very pleased with the insights that you have all shared and help in terms of helping us reflect on the road ahead with our relationship with Russia, on European security, and on the transatlantic relationship. You've all spent time in Russia and have a deep understanding of the politics, the economics, the society, and that you have very kindly shared with us today in your reflections on these questions. So we are deeply appreciative of your participating with us in this conversation. I know we'll have a lot of takeaways for our thinking on great powers competition, transatlantic relationship, and where we go from here. It is our pleasure as CSPC to put together conversations like this. And I do think that we need to open our aperture to some new thoughts on Russia, having observed this conflict now for most of this year, and thinking about where we go as it draws into a medium and long-term situation. I was pleased that you all, I think, exhibited a mix of both realism and some optimism as to the potential long-term future of American and European relationships with Russia. So as long as there's some hope, there's reason to keep working towards that goal. And I know that we all will. So I just want to say thank you for being with us, for helping drive what was an incredibly interesting conversation. And I want to say thank you also to Joshua Huminski for pulling this event together and very capably moderating the questions. We look forward to seeing you all again. Thanks to our participants for joining us and for sending in questions today. And we look forward to carrying this conversation forward. Thank you all. Be well. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you, Glenn.